The giant screen froze on one red number, and Adrian smiled like the room already belonged to him. Crystal chandeliers poured white light over the charity gala as 24 guests turned toward the stage. Donors paused with champagne halfway to their lips. Journalists raised their phones. At the center of it all stood Adrian Whitmore, one hand in his pocket, the other resting on a silver remote, as if he were about to close a deal instead of humiliate a stranger. Behind him, a 20-foot financial summary from Whitmore Capital's Youth Housing Initiative glowed above the ballroom. Revenue columns, grant allocations, construction draws, audit stamps. Every figure looked polished enough to survive a federal hearing. Adrian's voice carried easily across the room. "One mistake," he said, calm and amused. "Find one material error in this report tonight, and I'll transfer 1% of Whitmore Capital's personal foundation holdings to whoever spots it." The room broke into low laughter, impressed more by the audacity than the offer. 1% was not a party prize. It was a number large enough to buy buildings, change careers, alter bloodlines. He let the silence build before adding the part that sharpened the blade. "Anyone can try." His eyes moved across tuxedos, sequin gowns, board members, and cameras, then stopped on Lena Hart. She was standing near the back service corridor in a simple dark dress that cost less than some of the handbags in the room. She wasn't on the donor list. She had come as a last-minute replacement analyst from a partner firm after her managing director fell sick. Her badge gave her access to the ballroom, but not to anyone's respect. Adrian tilted his head slightly, just enough for the nearest guests to follow his gaze. "Especially fresh eyes," he said. A few people turned fully now, taking her in with the careless curiosity reserved for someone who had not been invited into power, only near it. Lena felt the heat of that attention, but her face stayed composed. She had spent too many years being underestimated to flinch every time it happened. One of the legal observers murmured that the challenge should be limited to credentialed auditors. Another executive smiled and said the billionaire probably wanted the spectacle. Adrian heard both and ignored them. "Full transparency," he said. "My legal team is here. The report has already been cleared internally. If anyone believes they see an error, they can state it publicly. If they're right, I pay. If they're wrong, they explain why they thought they were qualified to challenge it." That landed exactly as he intended. Not a game. A trap with polished edges. Lena studied the screen instead of him. She noticed the confidence first, and then the architecture of it. The pages had been chosen to be visible from a distance. Rounded numbers where detail should have been sharp. Timing categories compressed into annual summaries. A report designed to survive applause, not scrutiny. The guests were waiting for someone foolish enough to step forward. Adrian was waiting too, though for a different reason. He had built his reputation on reading weakness in seconds. The young analyst in the plain dress looked steady, but still. Smart, maybe. Ambitious, likely. Dangerous? Not a chance. If she spoke and failed, the room would remember its hierarchy before dessert was served. Lena reached for a printed program from an empty place setting and flipped it over to the blank side. Then she borrowed a pen from a passing server without asking permission. Small act. Quiet act. But it changed the current in the room. She was not retreating. She was preparing. Adrian noticed. "What's your name?" he asked. She looked up at him for the first time. "Lena Hart." "And do you usually audit from 40 feet away, Lena Hart?" A few guests laughed. "No," she said. "Usually I audit from cleaner data." The laughter died so fast it almost made a sound. One of Adrian's lawyers stepped closer to the stage, alert now. Crystal glasses stopped ringing against silver trays. The joke had ended too quickly for the room to pretend it had only been a joke. Under the chandelier light, 24 gala guests shifted in their seats, no longer relaxed donors and executives enjoying a charity spectacle, but witnesses sensing that something cleaner and sharper had entered the air. At the edge of the stage, the 3 members of the Whitmore Capital legal team stood in a subtle line, not intervening yet, only measuring risk. Adrian Whitmore let the silence stretch. It was the kind of silence he usually owned. Then he smiled, slow and polished. "Cleaner data?" he asked. "That sounds expensive. You must know exactly what you're looking at." Lena Hart set her glass down on a passing tray and stepped out from her table. Not rushed, not theatrical, just certain. Her black dress was simple compared to the jeweled crowd, but certainty gave it its own kind of elegance. Every eye followed her as she moved closer to the stage. I know enough to say the number on your screen shouldn't agree with the supporting chart beneath it, Lena said. Not if both came from the same quarterly model. A murmur traveled through the room. Behind Adrian, the giant gala screen still displayed the challenge that had started all this. Find the single mistake in Whitmore Capital's public philanthropic impact presentation and earn 1%. It had been delivered as entertainment, a billionaire proving that no one in the room was as sharp as he was. Most people had laughed, posed, and failed politely. Lena had not failed politely. Adrian studied her now with a cooler expression. You're saying the mistake is in the math? No, Lena said. I'm saying the math is too neat. That line landed harder than the first one. One journalist at table 6 lowered his phone and started recording for real. A donor who had laughed earlier now looked down at her program, as if it might hide her. Adrian descended the 2 steps from the stage instead of ordering Lena up to him. It was a small choice, but the room felt it. He was closing distance because he wanted to judge the threat for himself. You've had about 3 minutes with the material, Adrian said. So either you're bluffing, or you've seen something everyone else missed. Lena held his gaze. I didn't see more. I trusted less. That drew no laughter at all. The legal team exchanged a glance. One of them moved toward the projection console, ready if Adrian signaled. He did not. Not yet. What do you do, Lena Hart? Adrian asked. I'm a financial analyst. A few heads turned again, this time with a different kind of attention. Not amusement now. Calculation. Adrian nodded once. Then you know accusations have weight. And you know public offers do too, Lena replied. There it was, the first clean boundary crossed. She was no longer merely answering his challenge. She was binding him to it in front of witnesses. A pulse tightened in Adrian's jaw. Careful, he said quietly. Careful is why I spoke, Lena said. If I were reckless, I'd name the mistake before I confirmed whether your team wanted truth or only applause. The sentence hit the room like a match dropped near silk. For the first time that night, Adrian looked less entertained than interested. He turned his head slightly toward his legal team. Did we release the full appendix to the room? No, one lawyer answered. Only the presentation deck. Lena heard it, and Adrian saw that she heard it. Something changed between them then. He understood she had reached her conclusion without the hidden documents. She understood he now knew that too. You made that call from one slide and one chart. Adrian asked. From one chart, Lena said. The slide only confirmed that whoever built this wanted people looking at the headline number, not the foundation under it. The room inhaled together. This was no longer a party stunt. This was a credibility test. A murmur rippled through the ballroom like wind crossing a frozen lake. What had begun as entertainment now threatened to become evidence, and evidence demanded rules. The 24 gala guests leaned forward in careful silence while the 3 members of the Whitmore Capital legal team moved with sudden precision, no longer decorative figures in dark suits, but a wall forming around the screen. One attorney asked for the projector feed to be paused. Another requested the source deck. The third spoke low to Adrian Whitmore, reminding him that any public allegation tied to donor funds, valuation language, or disclosure practices could trigger obligations far beyond the room. The warning was not dramatic. That made it sharper. Lena Hart did not step back. She stood at the foot of the stage with one hand still resting near the laptop, her posture composed, as if numbers had given her a steadier spine than approval ever could. Adrian studied her for a long second, then looked out across the room. No one leaves, he said, and no one deletes anything. That changed the temperature immediately. Journalists straightened. Donors stopped whispering behind lifted glasses. Executives who had smiled a little too easily 10 minutes earlier now looked at the giant screen as if it might testify against them. This was no longer about whether Lena had seen something unusual. It was about whether Adrian was willing to let that finding touch his own house. One of the lawyers objected at once. A private review, he said, would protect the company, the foundation, and everyone present from reckless interpretation. Another added that a public dissection could expose proprietary models and unfinished analysis. Their concern was practical, but it carried another purpose too. Control the room, contain the damage, and return the balance of power to where it belonged. Lena heard it. Adrian heard it too. What exactly are your terms? Adrian asked, not taking his eyes off the frozen chart. The question turned every face back to Lena. She answered without drama. A clean copy of the full supporting workbook. The audit notes behind this presentation, and 10 minutes where no one interrupts while I trace the inconsistency. A few guests exchanged glances. She was not asking for a spotlight anymore. She was asking for access. The legal team resisted immediately. Internal work papers could not be handed over to an outside analyst in a crowded ballroom. Chain of custody mattered. Privilege mattered. Context mattered. Every word was chosen to slow the moment down. Lena shifted her gaze from the lawyers back to Adrian. Then appoint one of them to stand beside me and open it themselves. I don't need control. I need the underlying formulas. It was the first move in the room that did not sound like defense. It sounded like confidence. Adrian's jaw tightened. By accepting, he risked exposing a structural flaw in front of donors, executives, journalists, and legal observers. By refusing, he would confirm that the headline had been safer than the truth beneath it. Either choice cost him something new. Not money yet. Authority. He made the decision with visible reluctance. Bring up the workbook. The command landed harder than any raised voice could have. A lawyer unlocked a secure file from a tablet linked to the presentation system. Another insisted the review be limited to the sheet tied to the displayed chart. Adrian overruled that too. If the foundation matters, the links matter. That sentence bought Lena exactly what she needed and cost Adrian the first piece of the shield surrounding him. Rows of cells opened across the screen in pale blue and white. Lena stepped closer. The ballroom reflected dimly in the glossy display. She did not rush. Instead, she traced the architecture of the model aloud so even the guests with no finance background could follow. Revenue assumptions, restricted donations, carryover obligations, timing adjustments. Then she stopped at a nested formula hidden beneath a subtotal line that should have reconciled but did not. There, she said. One attorney leaned in and frowned. The formula referenced a range from a prior quarter that had already been revised. The attorney's frown changed the temperature of the room faster than the air conditioning ever could. A few guests set down their champagne flutes without realizing it. Across the long gala table, the projection still glowed with elegant confidence, but confidence had become fragile now. One broken cell in a spreadsheet had done what no rival on Wall Street had managed all year. It had forced Whitmore Capital to stop performing and start looking. Adrian Whitmore did not speak first. That silence mattered more than any defense would have. It gave Lena Hart something she had not been given all evening: procedural ground. She did not push the victory. She moved one step back from the screen, folded her hands, and looked not at Adrian Whitmore, but at the three members of the Whitmore Capital legal team. If that range carried over from a revised quarter, she said evenly, then this subtotal is wrong only if the override below it was written to preserve the old donor restriction schedule. If it wasn't, then I'm wrong. One of the lawyers asked for the source file. That request changed the contest from spectacle to audit. A technician hurried over with a secured laptop from the presentation console. The ballroom's music had long since died. Even the journalists among the 24 gala guests stopped whispering and simply watched. No one wanted the summary anymore. Everyone wanted the trail. Lena did not touch the keyboard. That choice surprised Adrian Whitmore more than the accusation had. Most people, once handed a stage, rushed to own it. Lena Hart refused the trap of appearing manipulative. Instead, she directed the search aloud, forcing the process into the open where every donor, executive, and legal observer could follow the logic. It was not about proving she was smarter than anyone in the room. It was about proving the numbers had a history, and history left fingerprints. Open the donation classification sheet from Q2, she said. The technician obeyed. Now the deferred obligations tab. Scroll to the gray columns. Keep going. Cell references spilled down the screen in neat rows, sterile and obedient. But beneath them, a hidden line item appeared after one of the lawyers expanded a grouped section near the bottom of the model. A second murmur passed through the ballroom. The line was labeled as a temporary bridge adjustment, small enough to avoid attention on a summary page, but large enough to alter the optics of the foundation's year-end health. Lena's eyes narrowed. That isn't the mistake, she said. Adrian Whitmore finally lifted his gaze to her. The room had expected triumph from her by now, maybe even revenge. What it got instead was discipline. That line explains the symptom, Lena said, not the cause. For the first time, one of the lawyers turned to Adrian Whitmore instead of to the screen. Who approved the bridge adjustment? No one in this room signed off on that line tonight, Adrian Whitmore said. It was a careful answer, but not a clean one. Lena heard it. So did the journalists. The hunt went deeper. She asked for edit history, then access permissions. One lawyer objected at once, citing internal controls and donor confidentiality. A fair boundary, and a dangerous one. If Adrian Whitmore shut the file there, he could claim prudence. If he let the search continue, he risked exposing something uglier than a calculation error in front of 24 witnesses. He made the harder choice. Open the log, Adrian Whitmore said. The technician hesitated only a second before entering credentials supplied by legal. Timestamps rolled onto the screen. Quarter-end revisions. Late-night adjustments. Comment removals. An override inserted at 11:47 p.m. on the final close date. Then another revision at 12:13 a.m., after the reviewed version had supposedly been locked. One of the attorneys went still. The lock was bypassed, he said quietly. Now the room understood the shape of the danger. This was no longer about whether Lena Hart could spot a flaw under pressure. Silence spread in widening circles from the projection screen to the back wall of the ballroom, where 24 gala guests now stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the gold wash of the chandelier light. What had started as amusement had turned into calculation. Donors stopped smiling. Journalists stopped pretending not to record. Even the three members of the Whitmore Capital legal team no longer looked like protectors of a polished spectacle. They looked like men measuring fallout. Lena Hart did not touch the keyboard again. That, more than anything, shifted the balance. Up to that moment, the room had treated her skill as the surprise. Now her restraint became the sharper weapon. She stepped back from the laptop on the narrow stage table and let the timestamps remain on the screen without embellishment, without triumph, without another word that could be mistaken for performance. The evidence did not need her help anymore. Adrian Whitmore's jaw tightened, but he did not look at Lena Hart first. He looked at his own legal team. The oldest of the three attorneys walked closer to the screen and asked for the source file. Not with suspicion toward Lena Hart, but with procedural urgency. One of the ballroom technicians handed over the connected drive. The attorney opened the audit trail again, checked the embedded version history, then checked the internal approval chain. His expression changed in increments, each one smaller and more dangerous than the last. This revision path didn't come from an outside intrusion, he said. The words landed harder than the bypass itself. A journalist near the center aisle lowered her phone for the first time all evening. One of the donors, an older woman who had been laughing at the challenge less than 10 minutes earlier, turned to look directly at Adrian Whitmore as if seeing not wealth, not confidence, but exposure. Lena Hart watched him in profile. For the first time, the billionaire who had controlled the room by setting the terms no longer controlled the meaning of them. The second attorney asked a direct question. Who had executive override privileges on this file after lock? No one answered immediately. That delay became its own answer. Adrian Whitmore finally spoke. A limited number of senior officers. The youngest attorney did not let that stand as a shield. Names. The room changed again. This was no longer a technical puzzle, and it was no longer social embarrassment. It had become an internal line of accountability, and the pressure had moved upward toward the architecture of power itself. Adrian Whitmore's eyes returned to the screen, then to Lena Hart, and for one brief second something unfamiliar crossed his face. Not anger. Not yet. Recognition. Because Lena Hart had not merely found a spreadsheet mistake. She had uncovered a break in the system that depended on authority to stay invisible. One of the legal observers among the guests spoke from the crowd. If the file was altered after legal review, the charitable disclosures attached to tonight's numbers may be compromised. That sentence cut deeper than mockery ever could. Compromised disclosures meant donor exposure. Donor exposure meant regulatory scrutiny. Regulatory scrutiny meant the empire Adrian Whitmore had spent 2 decades building could no longer rely on reputation as armor. A murmur rippled through the ballroom, but it no longer sounded like gossip. It sounded like distance opening. Lena Hart felt every eye move between her and Adrian Whitmore, waiting for him to crush, deny, or contain. Instead, he asked the question no one expected. When did you know it wasn't a formula error? His voice was low, controlled, but stripped of theater. Lena Hart met his gaze evenly. When I saw the corrected quarter references weren't random. Someone fixed the visible math and left the override buried in the locked sequence. That's not sloppiness. That's concealment. No one interrupted her. The oldest attorney exhaled slowly, as if the final shape of the danger had just finished assembling in his mind. Then this challenge created a discoverable record in front of witnesses. 24 guests, 3 in-house lawyers, cameras, timestamps, a public promise. Across the ballroom, the glow from the projection screen made every face look sharper, less forgiving. What Lena Hart had uncovered was no longer a technical flaw hiding in a dense financial model. It had become something else entirely: intent. One of the 3 Whitmore Capital attorneys stepped closer to the console table, asking for the source file without raising his voice. The request sounded calm, but everyone heard the urgency inside it. Adrian Whitmore did not answer immediately. His gaze stayed on the spreadsheet, on the frozen sequence of cells Lena had isolated. The locked override nested beneath corrected figures that looked clean to the untrained eye. What had seemed, minutes earlier, like a spectacle designed to embarrass a woman in a room full of donors and executives had begun turning into a matter with legal edges. Lena did not look at Adrian when she spoke again. She enlarged the hidden sequence and highlighted a permissions log embedded in the revision history. The visible correction happened 43 minutes before the file was exported for tonight, she said. But the override authority was used after that. Different user credential. Same machine. That means the polished version was prepared for display, while the concealed trigger stayed alive underneath it. A murmur ran through the 24 guests, then stopped almost as quickly as it started. Journalists leaned forward. The legal observers exchanged glances. Even the donors, who had come expecting polished speeches and champagne civility, now understood they were watching evidence assemble itself in public. Then Lena did something no one expected. Instead of pushing harder at the numbers, she opened the gala's presentation folder and pulled up a second file. The charity allocation brief circulated to guests at check-in. "The real mistake isn't the formula," she said. "It's where the formula was meant to land." On the screen, side by side, she matched the concealed override against the allocation brief. The hidden trigger redirected 1% from an internal reserve line only if the fund crossed a certain donation threshold during the gala. But the reserve line was not corporate bonus money, not an executive expense account, not dead capital waiting to be reassigned. It was the emergency bridge fund promised to clinics in 3 underfunded counties for neonatal equipment and maternal care. The room changed all at once. This was no longer a question of whether Adrian Whitmore owed money because of a public challenge. This was a question of whether a system under his name had been prepared to siphon money from women and newborns while making the books appear balanced. For the first time that night, Adrian moved without control in his face. "That reserve account was protected," he said, too quickly. Lena turned then, and her expression stayed level. "It was supposed to be. But someone built an exception path that only activates after public donations surge. If no one looked beneath the displayed math, the shortfall would appear next quarter as an adjustment, not a theft. Quiet enough to survive. Small enough to defend. Hidden enough to deny." The oldest attorney from Whitmore Capital asked the question no one else wanted to ask aloud. Could Adrian Whitmore have authorized that path himself? The ballroom went still enough to hear fabric shift. Adrian's jaw tightened. He stepped to the screen and scanned the revision log with the concentration of a man trying to outrun his own memory. Then his hand stopped over a detail so small most people would never have noticed it. The authorization token attached to the override had been generated through his executive clearance, but the timestamp placed it during a private investor dinner in Boston, where he had been photographed continuously for nearly 3 hours. Lena saw it the same second he did. "That token was cloned," she said quietly. "Whoever set this up wanted your authority on it because no one would question access at that level. The hidden formula was meant to steal from the fund and leave you holding the signature." Shock did not soften Adrian. It hardened him. Being mocked had been one thing. Under the chandelier light, indignation moved faster than truth. A low murmur rolled through the ballroom as the accusation shifted shape in real time. What had begun as a spectacle at a charity gala was now something far uglier. Evidence of fraud tied to Adrian Whitmore's authority, revealed by the woman he had invited people to laugh at. The 24 gala guests did not speak as one body, but their silence had changed. Donors leaned away from their tables. Executives stopped pretending this was entertainment. Journalists glanced from the projection screen to Adrian, measuring the distance between power and liability. Near the stage, the three members of the Whitmore Capital legal team had already formed a tight line, their posture alert, calculating. Lena Hart did not push forward. She did something more dangerous. She stepped back from the spotlight and let the evidence remain where everyone could see it. That restraint cornered Adrian more effectively than confrontation would have. His jaw tightened. "A cloned token proves a breach," he said, voice even, carrying to the far end of the room. "It does not prove intent. And it certainly does not prove that Whitmore Capital built the model to steal from anyone." The distinction was sharp, surgical. It gave the room a reason to hesitate. One of the legal observers among the guests rose halfway from his seat. "Then deny the formula," he said. "Not the access. The formula." Adrian did not answer at once. That pause landed harder than outrage. Lena turned toward the screen, not toward him. "The theft trigger was buried under a donor protection adjustment," she said. "It activated only after returns crossed a threshold high enough to avoid early scrutiny. Whoever wrote it understood oversight rhythms, media timing, and executive review windows. This wasn't random sabotage. It was designed to survive inspection." A journalist near the center aisle lifted a phone, then lowered it again. Recording this felt less like gossip now and more like preserving testimony. Adrian finally moved, but not toward Lena. He walked to the legal team. The ballroom watched the brief exchange in lowered voices and guarded expressions. One lawyer spoke first, another shook his head once, and the third looked toward the exits as if calculating containment. When Adrian turned back, there was a new coldness in him. Not ignorance now, but choice. "We suspend the demonstration," he said. "Tonight's challenge is void. The environment has been compromised." A ripple went through the room. It was the cleanest escape available to him. If the challenge was void, the promise attached to it could be argued into dust. Lena looked at him then, fully. No anger. No plea. Only recognition. "You made the offer before the breach was exposed," she said. "You set the terms. You asked for one mistake, publicly, in front of donors, executives, journalists, and legal observers. I found it." Adrian's expression barely changed. "You found a criminal intrusion. I found the mistake that made it possible," Lena replied. "The hidden formula. The trust placed in a signature without verification. The assumption that no one at your level needed to be questioned." Her voice stayed calm, but every word narrowed the room around him. That was the mistake. This time, several guests spoke at once. "She's right. The challenge was public. You can't turn integrity into theater and then cancel it when it costs you." The pressure was no longer financial or technical. It had become moral, social, reputational, the kind that spreads through institutions long after a ballroom empties. For the first time that night, Adrian looked not powerful, but outnumbered. Still, pride held. "I will not let extortion wear the mask of principle." Lena did not flinch. "Then don't pay me tonight." The room stilled again. That was not what anyone expected. She reached for the wireless clicker beside the laptop and set it down on the table, as if ending an argument she did not need to win by force. "Put the model, the access logs, and the authorization trail into independent review before midnight. In writing, with your legal team present and the donors copied." Adrian Whitmore did not answer her at once. For the first time that night, silence worked against him. The ballroom had been built for applause, not scrutiny. Crystal light fell over white linen, polished silver, champagne flutes, and the tense faces of the 24 gala guests who no longer looked like an audience. They looked like witnesses. At the far end of the room, the three members of the Whitmore Capital legal team stood close together, no longer whispering advice with easy confidence. They were calculating exposure now, not optics. Lena Hart remained where she was, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, steady as if the floor beneath her had not just shifted the weight of a billion-dollar reputation. She had not asked for a dramatic victory. She had asked for process. That was what made her dangerous. Adrian understood that before anyone else did. If he refused independent review, every donor in the room would hear fear in it. Every journalist would frame it as concealment. Every legal observer would remember the challenge, the public promise, and the visible retreat. If he agreed, he would be surrendering control over the one thing men like him protected most fiercely, the narrative. One of the Whitmore Capital lawyers stepped forward and spoke in a careful, low voice meant to sound practical rather than panicked. There is no obligation to formalize anything tonight. Lena turned toward the lawyer, but her eyes stayed on Adrian Whitmore. No legal obligation, she said evenly. Only a moral one. And those are the ones people remember. The sentence landed harder than the accusation had. A donor near the center table set down his glass with a soft click that still carried across the room. She's right, he said. If the charity's forecasting model was manipulated before pledges were finalized, then every commitment tied to it is contaminated. That changed the room again. Until then, the scandal had belonged to Adrian's pride. Now it touched everyone's money, everyone's names, everyone's signatures. The cost had moved from personal humiliation to institutional trust. Adrian's jaw tightened. He looked at Lena, and for a brief second the mockery was gone. What remained was something less comfortable: recognition. She had given him one path that did not smell of cowardice. It was expensive, public, and irreversible, but it existed. He turned to his legal team. Draft it. The 3 words cracked through the ballroom. One of the lawyers hesitated. Adrian, if we put independent review in writing tonight, we trigger document preservation, donor notification language, and board disclosure. I know exactly what it triggers, Adrian said. His voice was calm, but calm now cost him more than anger had. Draft the authorization. Full access to the model, access logs, internal approvals, and fund transfer instructions related to the gala projections. Independent review begins tonight. Donors copied. Legal observers copied. The nearest journalist did not even pretend not to take notes. A fresh murmur moved through the room, but this time it was not feeding on spectacle. It was measuring consequence. Several donors exchanged glances that carried the same cold arithmetic. If the review verified Lena's finding, then money pledged under a distorted projection might freeze, unwind, or redirect before dawn. Adrian reached for the microphone on the lectern. The movement was small, but everyone saw what it meant. He was no longer managing a scene. He was paying for it. When I made the challenge, he said, I did it believing no one here could identify a flaw in that model. Lena Hart did. His pause was brief, visible, and costly. The review will proceed immediately, and if her finding stands, I will honor every term stated in public. No applause followed. Only a sharper silence. Because another truth had entered the room with his concession. 1% of a major fund was not a symbolic prize. It was power, governance rights, access, a permanent place at a table built to keep people like Lena outside it. One of the legal observers spoke from the back. Then the review is no longer the only issue. Adrian lowered the microphone slowly. The observer continued. If the authorization trail leads where she says it leads, this becomes a question of who altered the numbers under your roof, and whether they did it to protect the fund or to use your promise against you. Lena's gaze sharpened. Adrian's did too. The challenge was no longer whether she had found the mistake. It was who had made it, and who was prepared to lose everything once the paper trail started naming names. The room stayed still long enough for the chandeliers to start humming louder than the people beneath them. Then Lena Hart moved first. She did not raise her voice. She did not look toward the doors. She did not ask anyone to believe her again. She simply turned to the 3 members of the Whitmore Capital legal team and slid the marked pages across the linen-covered table nearest the stage. Page 14, she said. Cross-reference the authorization override with the donor allocation correction on page 22, then the backdated approval on page 31. The nearest attorney opened the packet, frowned, and passed it to the others. What had been spectacle all evening became procedure. Pens came out. Phones were lowered. The 24 gala guests watched as the mood of the room shifted from curiosity to accountability. Adrian Whitmore stood at the center of it, broad-shouldered and silent, his black tie loosened by exactly half an inch, as if control itself had finally cost him something visible. One of the attorneys looked up first. The override did not originate with Lena Hart, he said carefully, and it did not come from the Foundation's standard review path. Another attorney added, it was pushed through under executive emergency authority, then concealed inside a reconciliation entry. A low murmur traveled through the guests like wind through dry leaves. Adrian took the packet from their hands and read the final page himself. His jaw tightened, then loosened. He read the signature block twice, not because he had failed to understand it, but because understanding it in public was a different kind of wound. The authorization trail did not lead to Lena. It did not even stop at a careless subordinate. It led to Adrian. Not because he had stolen from the fund, and not because he had designed the manipulation, but because months earlier he had signed a broad emergency authority order after a hospital called during the night to tell him his mother might not live until morning. Someone inside his company had later used that standing power to bury the transfer under his name. He had built the machine that made the lie possible. And in front of everyone who had watched him mock a woman for trying to expose it, that truth landed where pride used to stand. Lena looked at him without triumph. That hurt more. The mistake wasn't only in the numbers, she said. It was in the assumption that power could move faster than accountability and still stay clean. No one interrupted her. Adrian lifted his head slowly. For the first time that night, he did not speak like a man defending a throne. He spoke like a man dismantling one plank at a time. She's right. The words struck the room harder than any denial could have. He turned toward the guests, the donors, the journalists, and the legal observers. My promise stands. In full. One of the journalists stepped forward. 1% of Whitmore Capital. Adrian did not flinch. 1%, transferred exactly as stated. The number landed like a physical force. Even among wealth, there were amounts that silenced a room. He faced the legal team. Draft it now. Non-voting equity converted into a protected charitable controlling trust under Lena Hart's authority. He looked at Lena then, and the correction in his expression was sharper than any apology. Not as a prize, as governance. The legal team stared. One of them asked, "You want the transfer executed tonight?" That was the price. Not humiliation. Not money alone. Control. He was not merely paying what he had promised. He was surrendering the part of power that had allowed promise to become performance. Lena held his gaze. If this goes through, it doesn't protect your image. It isn't supposed to, Adrian said. The attorneys began typing. Screens glowed pale blue beneath crystal light. The guests who had laughed earlier now stood in a silence edged with shame. The journalists recorded every second. The donors watched a billionaire choose transparency over self-preservation, because anything less would prove Lena right in the worst way.